Welcome to Apex Apologetic, where we're all about connecting young minds to Christian truth. Here, we dive into the big questions, tackle doubts, and explore the powerful truths of Christianity in today's world. Our mission is to empower you to understand, defend, and confidently live out your faith. If you're ready to build a resilient, reasoned faith, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Shaun Michael. Let's go! All right, welcome back to the Apex Apologetic Podcast. I'm Shaun, your guide through the intersection of faith and reason, where we tackle big questions with clear thinking, a bit of humor, and let's be honest, sometimes a touch of sarcasm when the moment calls for it. Last time, we explored the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. We walked through the solid historical foundation that shows Jesus really did rise from the dead. But today, we're taking things a step further. Because here's the thing, while the evidence for the resurrection is compelling, objections to it come flying in from all directions. Some people argue Jesus didn't die, he just fainted. Others suggest the disciples stole the body, or the whole thing was a hallucination, as wild as that sounds. And then there's the real creative stuff, like the twin hypothesis, because apparently Jesus had an identical brother no one thought to mention until now. All right. And these objections might sound plausible on the surface, especially when presented by skeptics like Matt Dillahunty or from groups like Islamic Apologists who not only deny the crucifixion, but who reject the resurrection entirely. But when you dig into the details, they all crumble like a sandcastle under a rising tide of evidence. And today we're going to do two things. One, we're going to rebut these objections one by one. We'll analyze each alternative theory skeptics and other religions offer and show why the resurrection of Jesus provides the best explanation of the facts. And two, we're going to educate you on the intent behind this method. This isn't just about playing gotcha with skeptics. It's about demonstrating that the resurrection is not only true, but also the most reasonable explanation when weighed against competing theories. And why is this important, right? We always need to know, why does this matter? Because we live in a world filled with alternate explanations. People will say, well, couldn't it have been this or that? But the goal here is to show that Christianity's claim about the resurrection is not only theologically significant, but also logically and historically superior to the alternatives. So buckle up, grab your notebook, or at least something caffeinated, and let's dive into the ultimate rebuttal session. This episode is going to be a masterclass in defending the cornerstone of our faith. And before we dive into dismantling these objections, I want to quickly revisit the claim we're defending. The Christian position is simple yet profound, that Jesus died by crucifixion, was buried, and rose on the third day, just as the Apostle Paul summarized in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. And what makes this claim unique is that it's not just a spiritual metaphor or some vague religious story. No, not at all. The resurrection is presented as a historical event grounded in eyewitness testimony. The Gospels and early creeds make it clear. People saw, they touched, and they spoke with the risen Christ, the risen Jesus. And this wasn't wishful thinking. It was a life-changing reality. So as we examine objections, remember, we're not just defending a belief system. We're defending a claim that stands or falls on historical and verifiable grounds. All right, so let's get into it. What do skeptics say, and why don't their objections hold up? So, objection number one, and we'll provide a response for it as well, and that's Jesus didn't die, he just swooned, right? Interesting word. But so we're going to kick it off with the swoon theory. And this is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Instead, he just passed out, or what they call swooned, and he later woke up in the tomb, rolled away the stone, and convinced everyone he had conquered death. And this objection is particularly popular among Islamic apologists. They often cite their own holy book, the Quran, specifically Surah 4, 157, which says, "They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so." In other words, the Quran denies Jesus' death altogether. But here's an important point. Islam, as a religion, arose more than 600 years after the events of the resurrection. It's not even remotely close to being a contemporary witness. Think about that. 600 years later. In a completely different cultural and historical context, we get a claim that contradicts the first-hand accounts we have from the first century. That's like someone today trying to tell you what really happened during the Crusades based on no direct evidence. So, with all due respect, Islam, the Quran's claim, isn't a reliable source when it comes to historical accuracy on this event. All right, now let's get back to the swoon theory itself and examine it with a little medical science, logic, and a dash of common sense. First up, let's look at the medical science. We went over this last episode a little bit, but let's just remind you, if you're just tuning in, that Roman crucifixion wasn't something you walked away from. These guys were professionals, and their job was to ensure death. Jesus was flogged, which caused massive blood loss, and then crucified, a process that kills mainly by suffocation. And finally, a Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and eyewitnesses recorded a flow of blood and water, clear evidence of death caused by cardiac arrest and massive trauma. And let's not forget that Roman soldiers faced the death penalty if they messed up in execution. So they're not taking chances here. They're not risking their own lives. Now let's look at this from a logical perspective. Let's imagine the impossible, that Jesus somehow survived. After being flogged, nailed to a cross, and stabbed, he wakes up in a sealed tomb, and from there he manages to unwrap himself from his burial linens, roll away a massive stone, and sneak past the Roman guards, all while severely injured. And even if he managed that, do we really think that Jesus showed up to his disciples half dead and limping, and then inspired them to believe? Inspired them to believe that he's the victorious Lord of life? More likely, they'd rush to get him medical attention, not start a movement proclaiming his resurrection. It's ridiculous, right? Because a barely alive, mangled man stumbling out of a tomb just screams, "I've conquered death." That's the kind of comeback story that wins sympathy, not allegiance to the point of martyrdom. So when we put the swoon theory under the microscope of medical science, historical reliability, and basic logic, it just doesn't hold up. Combine that with the fact that Islam, while offering an alternative explanation, is so far removed from the historical context of the resurrection, and this objection crumbles entirely. All right, so with objection number one, let's look at objection and response number two, and that's that the disciples stole the body. All right, so we're going to move on and cover one of the oldest objections in the book, the idea that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. And this theory isn't new. In fact, we touched on it last episode. It goes all the way back to Matthew 28:13, where Jewish leaders bribed the Roman guards to spread the story that the disciples had come during the night to take the body while the guards were sleeping. Now, on the surface, it might sound plausible, right, to someone trying to explain away the resurrection. But when you dig into the history and logic, and frankly, just a little common sense, this theory collapses faster than a poorly made house of cards. All right, so let's talk about the disciples for a moment. After Jesus' crucifixion, they weren't exactly brimming with confidence. They were hiding in fear, terrified that they might be next on the Roman execution list. So are we supposed to believe that this scared, scattered group suddenly found the courage to pull off a high-stakes heist involving trained Roman soldiers? And not only that, but let's consider what happened after the resurrection. The disciples didn't just claim Jesus rose from the dead. They staked their lives on it. Almost all of them were martyred for their faith. And here's the other thing. People don't willingly die for something they know is a lie, right? We talked about that. If they had stolen the body, they would have known the resurrection was a hoax. Yet instead of recanting under pressure, they went to their deathbed proclaiming it as truth. And then we can also look at the logistics of stealing the body. Archaeology helps us with this. The tomb wasn't some hole in the ground with a flimsy door. It was sealed with a massive stone, guarded by Roman soldiers. And these weren't amateurs. We talked about this. They were professionals, and they had serious incentive to keep watch. Falling asleep on the job wasn't just embarrassing, but I just talked about it. It was punishable by death. So are we really to believe that a group of unarmed, terrified fishermen managed to sneak past or overpower these trained Roman guards, then move a massive stone and steal the body? Come on, that's just highly unlikely. It's absurd to even bring up because, of course, a group of scared disciples who couldn't even manage to stay awake in Gethsemane suddenly turn into a crack squad of tomb-raiding ninjas? For real? Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so the stolen body theory doesn't hold water when we look at the historical behavior of the disciples, the logistical realities of a guarded tomb, and the sheer implausibility of the claim. It's an explanation born out of desperation with no evidence. All right. Objection and response 3 is up. And that's the famous, it was all a hallucination. Okay. So this is a favorite objection from skeptics. I don't know why, but it's the hallucination theory. And this one suggests that the resurrection appearances of Jesus weren't real. They were just mass hallucinations, wishful thinking on part of his followers. So Matt Dillahunty, a well-known atheist, once said, there are many cases of people seeing things they want to see. That doesn't make them real. And then we have Richard Dawkins, who's never one to shy away from dismissing religious claims. He's hinted at similar ideas, implying that people who claim to have seen Jesus were simply deluded. But here's the thing. Hallucinations don't work the way these skeptics think they do. All right, let's break it down. We have to look at the field of psychology. We know that hallucinations are a well-documented psychological phenomenon, right? But they're strictly individual experiences. They occur in one person's mind, like a dream or a mirage. You can't share a hallucination with someone else. So let's apply that to the resurrection. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:6 that over 500 people saw the risen Jesus at the same time. Let me repeat that, right? Over 500 people. And so are we really supposed to believe that all 500 of them had the exact same hallucination at the exact same moment? Come on. That's not a hallucination. That's extremely solid evidence. 500 eyewitnesses. Another compelling thing is that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes an intriguing point by mentioning that many of these 500 witnesses who saw the risen Jesus were still alive at the moment of his writing. So basically, Paul is inviting his readers, hey, fact check me. Don't just take my word for it. Go ask them yourself. They're still here. They're still alive, and you can talk to them. So if Paul were lying, this bold challenge would have been an open invitation for people to expose this fraud. Instead, it highlights his confidence in the truth of the resurrection and the reliability of the eyewitness accounts. And so what makes this testimony even stronger is the diversity of these appearances. Jesus didn't show up to one person in a dreamlike state. He appeared to individuals, small groups, and large crowds in different locations and in different settings. He ate with them, he walked with them, and he even allowed them to touch him. If these were hallucinations, they would have been inconsistent and confined to certain individuals, not experienced by a variety of people in such concrete and physical ways. All right, so let me get this straight. 500 people, they all had the exact same dream at the same time. What was this? The first century version of a viral TikTok trend? Hashtag Jesus is alive? Come on. When you examine the psychology of hallucinations and the detailed accounts of eyewitness testimony, the hallucination theory just doesn't hold up. It's an attempt to explain away the resurrection without actually addressing the overwhelming evidence. Okay, so that's objection and response 3. Next, we have objection 4 with its response, and this is the twin hypothesis or the body double. All right, so let's dive into another one of the most far-fetched objections to the resurrection, the twin or body double theory. This idea suggests that Jesus had a secret twin brother, yes, a twin, who either swapped places with him during his ministry or died on the cross in his place. And you've probably seen this one pop up in wild online videos, courtesy of figures like Joe Rogan, who's getting a lot better now after the Wes Huff interview, or the occasional Bart Ehrman soundbite, where anything remotely controversial about Christianity gets thrown into the mix, all right? So let's set the record straight. This theory actually traces back to a 3rd century Gnostic text called the Acts of Thomas. And in this text, Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples, is bizarrely claimed to be his twin brother. According to this very, very fringe narrative, Thomas was the one who died on the cross, not Jesus. But here's the thing, and this idea has zero historical or textual support from the Bible, the apostles, or the early church fathers. It's pure Gnostic fan fiction, all right? So first, the Bible doesn't mention a twin brother of Jesus, ever. Not at his birth, not during his ministry, and not in any of the gospel accounts of his death or resurrection. If Jesus had a twin, don't you think that might have been an important detail for anyone to mention? Moreover, none of the apostles or early church fathers, people who were intimately connected to the life and teachings of Jesus, say a word about him having a twin. In fact, the Gnostic Gospels, like the Acts of Thomas, were written centuries later by people far removed from the events they claim to describe. Unlike the New Testament, which stands up to rigorous textual criticism and has more manuscript evidence than any other ancient document, these Gnostic texts are unreliable at best and outright fabrications at worst. We don't even have all of it together. So remember, and we covered this in our Bible series, the New Testament documents are backed by early manuscripts, archaeological evidence, and eyewitness testimony. The Gnostic Gospels, by contrast, they lack all of these. They're more like ancient tabloids than serious historical records. Okay, and let's not forget about the people who actually knew Jesus: Mary Magdalene, Peter, John, and the other disciples. They're not just casual acquaintances. They lived with him, they walked with him, and ministered with him for years. And after the resurrection, they didn't just see him from a distance, they spoke with him, and they touched him, and they ate meals with him. The idea that these close companions could mistake a supposed twin or body double for the real Jesus is absolutely absurd. If someone tried to impersonate your best friend or family member, you'd spot it immediately. The disciples, they weren't fooled by an impersonator or an imposter. They were convinced by the risen Christ who they knew intimately. Okay, let's just think about this. This objection is riddled with ad hoc reasoning. It's a theory invented out of thin air with no evidence, purely to avoid the reality of the resurrection. It's like saying, well, what if Jesus was actually an alien in disguise? Sure, you could say that, but without evidence, it's nothing more than a desperate attempt to dodge the truth. So the twin or body double theory, it's just baseless, it's ridiculous, and it contradicts everything we know from reliable historical and biblical sources. It relies on fringe texts written centuries later and assumes Jesus' close friends and family were too clueless to notice a fraud. All right? And so with objection and response 4, we're going to move on to objection and response 5. The argument that other religions have resurrection myths. All right? So we're just going to drop the hammer on this objection. And it's as tired and as misguided, but it's the claim that the resurrection of Jesus was just borrowed from pagan myths. Wannabe intellectuals with a good Wi-Fi connection love to regurgitate this one after a quick Google search, thinking they've unearthed some hidden knowledge that no one else has thought to address in 2,000 years. I get these comments all the time. You have critics like Robert Price who have said things like, the resurrection is just another myth borrowed from pagan traditions. But when you actually look at these so-called parallels, they're about as convincing as a middle school book report written the night before it's due. So let's break this one apart piece by piece. So comparative religion. So the claim here is that Christianity plagiarized resurrection stories from pagan myths like those of Osiris, Mithras, or Dionysus. Sounds intriguing, right? Kind of piques your interest until you actually do some research. Take Osiris, for example. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is killed, dismembered, and scattered across Egypt. His wife Isis gathers the pieces, reassembles him, and brings him back to life. But here's the thing, Osiris doesn't come back in any meaningful sense. He becomes the god of the underworld. He's a glorified zombie, not a risen savior who conquers death. Or how about Mithras? Supposedly Mithras was born of a rock. Yes, a rock, and died and rose again, except there's no evidence that Mithras was ever said to have died, let alone resurrected, in any ancient text before Christianity. These claims about Mithras were fabricated by modern skeptics, not any sort of ancient sources. So I want you to compare that to the resurrection of Jesus. 1, we know Jesus predicted his death and resurrection in advance. 2, his resurrection was witnessed by hundreds of people in diverse settings. 3, the event sparked a movement that changed the world and converted staunch opponents like Paul. So no pagan myth comes remotely close to matching this kind of historical and evidential foundation. All right, and here's another angle. And even if there were superficial similarities between pagan myths and the resurrection, so what? Similarities don't disprove Christianity. In fact, they can highlight something deeper, a universal longing for redemption and renewal written into the human heart. And philosopher and theologian C.S. Lewis called this the true myth. pagan stories were echoes of a greater truth that finds its ultimate fulfillment in Christ. So Christianity didn't copy these myths, it revealed the reality they were already pointing towards. And again, this view is just riddled with logical errors. One, you have a post hoc fallacy here. Just because pagan myths existed before Christianity doesn't mean Christianity copied them. That's like saying airplanes were copied from birds because birds existed first. All right, it's ridiculous. Two, a false equivalence. The difference between pagan myths and the resurrection are so vast that comparing them is like saying the plot of Lord of the Rings was ripped off from Green Eggs and Ham. And number three, we have some confirmation bias here. Critics, what they do here is they cherry pick superficial similarities while ignoring the absolutely profound differences. Okay, so the claim that the resurrection was copied from pagan myths is nothing more than a lazy, surface level objection that falls apart even under the slightest scrutiny. You don't have to take a hard look at it. The historical, theological, and philosophical uniqueness of the resurrection makes it stand out as entirely distinct from anything in pagan mythology. All right, and next we're going to tackle another objection, the idea that the resurrection is just a late addition to Christian theology. Okay, so objection in response 6. The story was fabricated years later. So this objection gets thrown around by skeptics like Richard Carrier. The resurrection, where he says, is just another myth created to sustain the Christian movement. So this argument claims that the story of Jesus rising from the dead was fabricated years, if not decades, after the event supposedly took place. And depending on who you are, it may sound clever. It doesn't to me, but it sounds clever on the surface. But when you look at the historical evidence, this claim isn't just wrong. And this is why I say it doesn't sound clever. It's laughably far from the truth. So let's dig in and dismantle this objection piece by piece. So we need to talk about timelines. One of the most important pieces of evidence we have is the early creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, where Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." So scholars across the spectrum, Christians, skeptics alike, agree that this creed dates back to within just a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. We're talking about a time frame so short and tight that it would have been impossible for a myth or fabrication to develop without someone calling it out. Paul even says many of these witnesses were still alive. So as we talked about, that translates to, hey, if you don't believe me, go ask for yourself. And so the idea that the resurrection was some late invention just completely ignores the historical data. And we can actually trace some eyewitness testimony. Let's look at what this means. So we can look at a chain of eyewitnesses, which is central to the credibility of the resurrection. So first we have Mary Magdalene and the woman. And the first witnesses to the empty tomb, as we talked about, who saw the risen Jesus, were women. A detail no one would fabricate in a patriarchal society where women's testimony wasn't even admissible in court. So if you're making a story up, this would be the worst way to start. 2, we have Peter and the disciples. And these were men, we've hammered this home, who after the crucifixion were terrified and hiding, yet after encountering the risen Christ, they became bold preachers, willing to die for the message. Then we have Paul. Paul went from being a skeptic and an active persecutor of Christians to becoming one of the most influential figures in the early church after encountering the risen Jesus. Then you have, and here is really important for tracing eyewitness testimony. We have the eyewitness testimony. It didn't stop with the apostles. Although the apostles, we only have the original 12, and there were no more apostles after that. They had their own disciples. And this testimony was passed down through figures like John, the apostle John, who had a disciple named Polycarp, who had a disciple named Irenaeus. And so on and so forth. And so this creates a direct line of testimony from Jesus to the early church. So these leaders weren't passing down myths, they were preserving firsthand accounts, and they documented it in their writings. And again, this objection that the story was fabricated years later, it suffers from a host of logical fallacies, right? So first you have a fun one. chronological snobbery, right? It assumes that people in the ancient world were gullible and didn't care about evidence, when in reality, early Christians faced constant scrutiny and opposition from both Jews and Romans. So a fabricated story would have been debunked immediately. Two, we have an ad hoc fallacy, and that's the claim that the story was fabricated is made without any supporting evidence, right? There's nothing to support it. It's just a desperate explanation to avoid the conclusion of the resurrection. And a third one, probably not the only one, but just for the sake of time, is the argument from silence. So Carrier and others argue that just because some ancient documents don't mention the resurrection, it must not have happened. But silence isn't proof of absence, okay? And so think about it. If the resurrection were fabricated, you'd need to explain why the message spread like wildfire, even under persecution. Why people like Paul, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, risked their lives for a lie, and how Christianity outlasts and outshadows countless other movements of its time, many of which had the full backing of powerful empires, okay? So the claim that the resurrection was fabricated years later just is destroyed under the weight of historical evidence and eyewitness testimony. So far from being a myth, the resurrection stands as the most reasonable explanation for the rise of Christianity and the transformation of its earliest followers, okay? So before we wrap up, let's take a moment to recap the overwhelming strength of the evidence for the resurrection. I want to revisit the major pillars that build the case for it. And so, as we talked about, historical evidence. First, we have confirmation from non-Christian sources like Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, and Tacitus, a Roman historian. Both of these men, they had no reason to promote Christianity, but they record key details: that Jesus lived, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers believed he rose from the dead. And so even skeptics have to agree that Jesus' crucifixion is one of the best attested facts of ancient history. But then we have what we went over, the archaeological insight, the empty tomb, the accounts of Jesus' burial align with Jewish customs of the time, like being laid in a rock-hewn tomb and wrapped in linens, and the fact that women were the first witnesses to the tomb, highlighting a countercultural detail for a patriarchal society. And so this adds authenticity to the story, that if someone were fabricating this, they wouldn't use witnesses whose testimony was considered less credible in that culture. Then we have philosophical coherence. So think about the big picture, the resurrection. It provides the most plausible explanation for the rise of Christianity. You had a group of terrified disciples hiding in fear of Jesus' crucifixion. Then suddenly, they're boldly proclaiming that he's alive, willing to face imprisonment, torture, and death because they genuinely encountered the risen Christ. Nothing else best explains this transformation. And then we have mathematical improbability, right? I don't want to get technical or bore you here, but this is from a prophetic sense, that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies written centuries before he was born. So the odds of one person, just one, fulfilling even a handful of these prophecies by chance are astronomical. It's like trying to find a specific, like trying to find a specific grain of sand in the Sahara Desert. But the reality is Jesus didn't fulfill a handful, he fulfilled them all. So when you put it together, historical evidence, archaeological insights, philosophical coherence, and the sheer mathematical improbability of the prophecies, you begin to realize that the resurrection isn't just a matter of blind faith. It's the best explanation for the evidence we have. And this isn't about proving a point or winning an argument. Far from it. It's about understanding that the resurrection is the foundation of our faith, and that our faith, as a result, is built on solid ground. So take a step back from these objections and the evidence for a moment, and let's talk about why the resurrection matters. I hope I've hammered this home by now, because at the end of the day, this isn't an intellectual exercise or a debate to win. We're trying to win souls here, as well as that the resurrection has profound implications for every single one of us. So for the skeptics listening, if the resurrection is true, and I've given you plenty of evidence to show that it is, then it validates everything Jesus claimed about himself. He wasn't just a good teacher or a wise philosopher. He is the Son of God who came to save us. If he rose from the dead, then his words demand a response. You can't ignore the claims of someone who defeated death itself. And then for the believers out there, the resurrection is more than a historical event. It's the cornerstone of our faith. It assures us that our sins are forgiven, that death has been defeated and that we have eternal hope through Jesus Christ. And this isn't just good news, it's great news, and it's the best news in human history, and it should change the way we live every single day. And for the skeptics, I challenge you. I'm calling you out. Investigate the evidence with an open mind, objectively. Read the Gospels, study the eyewitness testimony. Ask yourself this: what if it is true? Because if it is, it changes everything, and eternity depends on it. Now, for my Christians out there, I want you to live like the resurrection happened, because it did. Don't keep this truth to yourself. Share it boldly, live it out passionately, and let it transform your life and the lives of those around you. And that wraps up today's episode of the Apex Apologetic Podcast. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the evidence for the resurrection and dismantling the objections that skeptics throw our way. Whether you're here as a believer looking to strengthen your faith or a skeptic exploring the big questions, I appreciate you taking the time to engage with these important truths. Next time, it's going to be our very last episode. We're going to step back and reflect on everything we've covered in season 1. We'll revisit the lessons, highlight the biggest takeaways, and talk about how to pull this all together and put this knowledge to good use in our daily lives. It's going to be the perfect way to wrap up this first season and get ready for what's ahead. Until then, keep asking questions, keep seeking truth, and remember, you don't have to leave your brain at the door to follow Jesus. Go ahead and subscribe and follow us on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and have a great week. I'll see you next time on the Apex Apologetic Podcast. I'm Shaun Michael, out.